Well, again, glad that we have everybody here with us today. And maybe I'll take you back. I think we've got reading week, so some people sitting, especially in the front row here, who are still in school, this may not be taking them too far, but you probably remember that time sitting in school, listening to your teacher just drone on about something or other. And okay, I won't be just pick on the teachers. You've probably been in church, maybe even more recently than school, and heard a preacher drone on and on and on. But you've probably thought to yourself, we'll just, for argument's sake, we'll just stick to the teachers. We'll put the blame on them. And you hear them going, and you're just trying to stay awake, and you're going, man, I know you're giving me information, but I have no idea why this is even relevant to my life. Otherwise that it might just be on a test at some point. I know as soon as this semester is done, I am just going to completely forget whatever bit of information. Especially in like classes like history. Now, I like history, but again, when you're trying to remember all those dates and all those names and all those treaties and all those places, it's just like, really? Again, does this mean anything? Does this make any difference in my life? How am I supposed to remember? But even in the midst of all those dates and times and events and things that you're trying to keep track of, and you're kind of wondering, okay, what value does this have for me? We get to the point where there are some things where we probably, if we're honest, like, okay, that event might be pretty consequential. Maybe it is important that I know something about World War I and World War II, or maybe the invention of the printing press and the microchip. Okay, maybe there were some consequential things that came out of that. So maybe it is important to know some bits and pieces of history along the way. But then there's certain things where it can seem so ancient, seem so foreign, but yet it just keeps coming back over and over again. It's like this same situation, the same story repeats itself. And even if you kind of wonder, like, does this really have anything to do with me? But you kind of realize it seems to be affecting lots of people, and people you would think shouldn't be interested in this seem to be overwhelmingly and spending too much preoccupation with this. So again, what am I referring to here? What kind of event, what kind of story seems to play over and over again? And seeing we're in church, you might be able to guess which one it is, but I'm referring to the people of Israel. It's amazing that this kind of small group of people, from a historic standpoint, just keeps seeming to emerge, just keeps seeming to be showing up on the front pages of the newspapers with seems to be like the same headlines year in, year out, generation after generation. That was close. All right? And people seem to be kind of occupied with this small group of people, culturally, politically, religiously, from all different backgrounds. And so the question that we want to ask ourselves, what are we to make of Israel? Now I'm going to use the term Israel. When I refer to that term Israel, it's kind of not a perfect term, but it encompasses a lot, right? It encompasses the people, right? The Jewish people. It can encompass the land, the historical or state of Israel. It can talk about the religion. So I'm just going to use that term Israel sort of in a broad context to bring it out. But just think about the people of Israel for just a second, and just the outsized influence and importance they seem to have in our world. So this group of people dates back to roughly about 4,000 years to the time of Abraham. Again, it's one of the oldest continuous people groups on the planet. It's never been very large or significant in size, at least in population size. Right now, there's probably more Jews living in the world than at any time, and that estimate is only around 16 to 18 million. They have gone in and out of exile from their ancestral homeland almost too many times to count. They have been spread and continue to be spread across the globe, and yet they still somehow seem to hold on to their identity, and no matter where they live, they've seemed to have faced severe persecution, have been cast out, and on occasion they've been tried to be intentionally annihilated. And even today they find themselves kind of front page having a skirmish over a piece of land that with groups of people that have come in and grow out of that piece of land that you could say actually dates all the way back to the time of Judges, almost 3,500 years ago. And a couple other things just to mention is, although there are several areas of conflict around the world today and in recent years, and we can just name a bunch of them, Russia and Ukraine. China has 2 million Uyghurs and enslavements. There's been millions displaced in the Congo in the last few years. Just this week, I don't know if people saw this, roughly 70 Christians, men, women, and children were beheaded in the Congo. Syria, Myanmar, Afghanistan's with casting out peoples in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, from their homeland. Dictatorships in places like North Korea, Iran, Venezuela, and many other places. Yet people get so bent out of shape, more so about Israel, right? Just think, just even months ago, there had protests in London, England, that they estimated about 500,000 people, right? Protests and encampments at universities and colleges across Canada and North America. Here's a unique stat. This is a Canadian stat. Jewish people are the biggest target of hate crimes. In Canada alone, they represent less than 1% of our current population, but they make up over 70% of all religiously motivated hate crimes and 56% of all hate crimes recorded in Canada, right? So this is just one unique people group. So the question is, it's a small group, but why does it get so much outsized attention? And often from people you think, well, why are they even interested in that? And again, it goes back to that question, what are we to do with Israel? What are we to make of them? And the reason why I bring this out, because if you go back to this, it's like, and you might be listening and like, okay, what does this have to do with me? How does this affect my life? The fact that this situation, this people group just keeps coming up again and again and again, it's at least worth asking the question. Well, we're looking at this portion of Scripture from Romans chapter 11. We'll turn there in just a minute. And it begins with this question, has God rejected these people? Now, my guess is we could probably answer that two ways. One way with what Paul's about to say, but even without looking at the text, we can probably answer that. The fact that we're even having this discussion today, the fact that the people of Israel still exist, seems to answer that question, that God isn't done with them, right? That the fact of their existence, it can almost only be explained by some divine miraculous intervention when you kind of compare it to just all these other different people groups that we know of around history. Despite everything that they face, they somehow seem to endure. Now, another side of that thing is you can ask yourself, okay, it looks like God's not done with them, that they still have a place, but if you're like me, I'm like, God, I'm not sure, the way you're handling it is the right way, because they've been through an awful lot. But let me just pick this up. We're going to look at it from a different perspective. But let me just quickly give a review. I'm not going to go for a review of the book, but just the two chapters that come before. Chapters 9, 10, and 11 really in the book of Romans deal with this argument, what's God's plan for the Israelite people? 2 weeks ago, we looked specifically at chapter 9. Next week, we're jumping a little bit out of order. Last week, Pastor Dan was supposed to be here looking at chapter 10. We kind of canceled that because of snow. He's going to come back next week, and we're going to look at chapter 10. So we're jumping ahead, and then we're going to go backwards. But let me just highlight a few things. Paul speaks in chapter 9 directly to his Jewish brothers and sisters in Rome, and they're really having this hard time because, again, all of a sudden, all these Gentiles are coming in to what they think is their Jewish faith, but they both accept this Jesus as this Jewish Messiah, Jesus. But as more and more Gentiles coming in, they're like, well, what's our place? As obviously we get some special status. And Paul's saying, like, it's not a competition. You should be excited. You should be thrilled about this. This is what God has promised. Next week when we look at chapter 10, Paul actually encourages his Jewish brothers and sisters, not only just don't be, see it as a competition, don't be against your Gentile brothers and sisters, but you should be part of this. This is part of the promise that God has promised all the way back from Abraham. Here are all the prophets that this is going to be, that your God is going to be the God of all people, right? This is exciting. You should be part of the plan in reaching out to as many Gentiles as possible. But now, as people are starting, and Paul is starting to see some of these Jewish people either reject Jesus outright, or people who have, but are kind of rejecting the Gentiles coming in and creating their own little branch, he's got some strong words. And again, the question that he begins with is, God rejected the Jewish people. And again, we looked at evidence from around the world that seems to suggest, despite the odds, they seem to be still front and center on a global stage. But listen to how he answers this. Verse 1 begins this way. I asked then, did God reject his people? And then Paul gives a very strong, definitive answer. By no means. And then the next thing Paul's going to say is, I'm not about to give up my Jewish ancestry. I'm still a loud and proud descendant of Abraham. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God did not reject his people, whom he foreknew. But then Paul's going to go and he's going to make a little change. And he says, maybe before we ask this question of whether God's rejected his Jewish people, the people of Israel, maybe there's another way to look at it. And he gives an illustration, and he probably can use, and he actually uses different illustrations along the way, but one specific illustration from the Old Testament. And again, in the scriptures, when there's an Old Testament, I'm just going to put the reference that Paul quotes. But he says this, don't you know what the scripture says about Elijah? How he appealed to God against Israel. Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and they are trying to kill me. And what was God's answer to him? But I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So too, as at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace, and if by grace, then it is no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. What's he saying? He says, let me tell you a situation back in your history, one that you know well. It was when one of your great prophets was living. It was the time of Elijah. And remember Elijah, he was there and he argued with God. He said, God, what have you done with my people? And the question is, and they all knew from that situation, at that time, God didn't reject Israel. Israel overwhelmingly rejected God. And it got to the point where Elijah, who is so distraught as this prophet of God, says, look, God, I am the only one left in this land. And then God says, okay, Elijah, I want to show you something. And he shows him a remnant of 7,000 people who have not bent the knee to Baal. You're not alone, Elijah. You're not forgotten. You're not abandoned. But it sets up this question is when we say, is God rejected Israel? Or can we flip it? Is Israel now rejecting their God? I kind of think of it this way. I'm happy I got all my kids here this morning because it's reading week. And my guess is we've all had this situation. Generally speaking, we have a pretty good relationship, eh? You showed up. That's impressive. But we probably all know situations. We probably all have it even in our own family at somewhere where there's estrangements. There's divisions, right? Parents break away from their kids. Brothers and sisters break away from one another. And it's easy to look at and says, well, why have you rejected that individual? And very often, for many times, it's like, I haven't rejected anybody. They've kind of rejected us. They've taken their own road. And this is what Paul is trying to get at. The rejection didn't come from God. The rejections come from the other way around. Paul, I'm just going to allude those. I think the references are on the board, but then he gives two other examples quickly. He just quotes. He goes, there were times and other times in Israel's past where they were taken the wrong place, and God says, okay, if that's the road you want to travel on, be at it. Go on, travel it. If that's your bed you want to take, lie in it. I'm going to give it to you. But again, that's not me rejecting them. That's them taking their own course. Now, Paul reminds me, just like a typical parent, one of the things that he wants to do and what he's trying to even do with this text is to literally encourage his Jewish brothers and sisters back into the fold. And again, just like a standard typical mom and dad, he's not above shaming them to try to change them their opinion. I had a different illustration, was a much better illustration, but because of time, I'm just going to switch it to this one. And I kind of remind and see if other people had a similar situation growing up in their family, if their mom and dad would use this tactic. But I grew up in a home where when your mom made dinner and you put that food on that plate, you did not leave that table until everything on your plate was done. Did anybody have terrible, cruel parents like that? Now, one of the things that would often happen is you'd go and you'd be just left with like those Brussels sprouts and lima beans left that you just do not want to eat. But you could not leave that table until that, like every little mouthful was taken. And I still remember my parents, you're sitting there, they'd clear that up, and then they would bring in dessert. You know, they'd have and they'd just like, this is delicious dessert. Jeff, you could love to have some of this chocolate cake, wouldn't you? Ooh, brother, would you like extra ice cream with that and whipped cream on top? Oh, but once you finish your dessert, you can have this. Anybody have cruel parents like that, right? Got a few of you, right? The idea was to kind of shame them in order to win them so that they would do what they're supposed to do. And this is really kind of what Paul's method is, the method behind his madness. Listen to 11 again. First, Paul just reaffirms that God by no means has rejected his people. Verse 11 says, again I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. And then it says this, rather because of their transgressions, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious, right? God has always promised from this beginning that the Gentiles were going to come in. But all of a sudden, now that it's happening, this is like, I don't like this. You know, it's got to be us or them. But Paul's saying, like, if they see it, hopefully they'll see these Gentiles receiving this blessing and be encouraged and be grateful. But then it says this, but if their transgressions means riches for the world and their losses means riches for the Gentiles, right at the end, the more people that are brought into God's kingdom, the greater the blessing is. If some lose out, some more can win. That's a tough trade, but that's kind of what Paul is saying. But he says, how much greater riches will their wellness bring? That's one way to look at, but it's the best way to look at it is if both win. It's not a winner or loser, but both are winners. Both are excited about being brought into this fold. Now, Paul does something in verse 13. He makes an abrupt transition, an abrupt change. Pretty much most of his letter is written to his Jewish brothers and sisters in Rome, right? He's appealing to them. He's trying to keep them and holding them into this newfound faith in Jesus Christ. And he knows that this, the inclusion of the Gentiles is a tough one for them. But now he speaks directly for the first time to the Gentiles. And he also kind of warns them in the same way that he's warned his Jewish brothers and sisters. Listen to what he says. He goes, I am talking to you Gentiles. Inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, I make much of my ministry in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. So again, what Paul's saying, he's like, Gentiles, right? I'm talking to you. One of the reasons I'm reaching out to you and I'm focusing my attention on you so that some of my brothers and sisters will see what I'm doing and want to get in on the action, to encourage and reach out to the Gentiles as well, to be embracing and to accept them as well. And again, verse 14, for if their rejection is reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Again, so this idea with, if we can have both Gentiles and Jews together, it's like bringing life where there is death. And then he gives two illustrations. If part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. Now, this is maybe a little bit confusing, but Paul gives, again, two illustrations, and we're going to focus on the second one. And this is the one about the roots and the branches, because this is the one that Paul is going to refer to and expand on. And it's specifically roots and branches of an olive tree. Now, I'm going to just, in a moment, I'm just going to show you an illustration on the screen in just a moment. And I just want to speak to this before we actually read it. So the next section that we're going to look at, again, deals with this situation of, okay, what are we to do or what are we to make of Israel? And this is one of those really controversial portions of Rome, of the book of Romans, where lots of people have different ideas. And basically what Paul is saying, as you're going to hear, is there's a tree. You got a tree, and you got two main parts of the tree. You got the roots, and you got the branches. Now, the question that I'm going to ask before we go to this, what's the most important part of the tree, the root or the branches? Roots. Okay, good. We got that. Okay. Now, often when we look, especially in spring time, if that ever happens this year, and things start turning green, we look at look at the beautiful leaves, look at the beautiful trees, look at all the and that is what takes our attention. But the life and the nourishment always comes from the roots. Sarah and I, our home, we have a little creek in the backyard, and it's like a little bit of a rainforest. It just turns into a jungle. We cannot keep it. So every spring, I am out there. I'm out there with my clippers. I'm out there with my chainsaw. I'm out there with my Sawzall, and I'm just cutting down branches. Now, in the first service, I said I was out there with my chainsaw cutting limbs, and somebody says, you might not want to use that picture. That's not the right picture to use. So we'll just say we're cutting branches, right? And I don't have to worry. I can cut as much as you want because the roots are strong that the next year I'm just going to go back and just be cutting back those same branches again. But if I want to get rid of that plant or that tree for good, I go and I attack the roots to kill it. And in this illustration, Paul's saying, look, branches are going to be cutting off and coming back and grafted in and cut off and grafted in, and it's kind of hard to make sense of. But the one thing he points is what matters is the roots. Are the branches connected to the roots? So here's a good little illustration. And again, this is the way that people have tried to look at Romans 11 and tried to understand it, try to speculate, okay, what is Israel's place? And usually in a future way. So Jesus comes, he's this Jewish Messiah. Some people accept him, some don't. And these are three just general ways people have answered. There's lots of, again, various ways and different versions of this. But it says this, okay, the first one is that the church replaces Israel. Israel, the Jewish people, they rejected Jesus as their Messiah, so God moved over, made the attention the Christians and the Christian church, and the church replaces it. It's the new Israel. They're the new representative of Israel, and the Jews had their time and they're gone, right? There's even a theology behind that called replacement theology, okay? The second type of way people answer this is just, okay, you got the same root system, but you got two separate branches. You got the branch of the church, the Christian church. They're kind of going their own way, taking their own path. And then you got Israel, they're just another set of branches, and they're going their other path, right? A third way looks at this. It says, okay, Israel, by and large, has rejected the church, the root system of Jesus as the Messiah. And so the church is kind of taken over, and the church is kind of leading this way, but at some point, Israel is going to be grafted back in and join in. There's going to be a great turning back around back again to their root system and a great acceptance of Jesus as their Messiah. So the answer is, which one is it? Which one is Paul pointing to? The way that I'd answer is maybe something different that's not provided there, but let's look at the passage now. Maybe there's another way to consider what Paul is talking about. Verse 17. If some of the branches has been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. So again, you get this idea, there's the branches, and the Gentiles are now this wild olive shoot, and you're going to hear later on, Israel is going to be the natural olive shoot, and we've been grafted in, but again, the issue is the nourishment that comes from the root. But then listen to what Paul says in verse 18. Again, he's speaking to the Gentiles. He said, do not boast over those branches. Again, it's the same thing. Don't see it as an us and them. Don't see it in a competitive way. Listen to this. If you do consider this, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Again, what's the most important? Is it the root or the branches? Where does the life and the nourishment come? Does it again come from the root or from the branches? And the obvious thing is it's from the root. And he says this, you will say then branches were broken off so I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith, not to be arrogant, but to be afraid. For God, if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. So Paul is saying, look, Gentiles, now that you're seeing some of these Jewish brothers and sisters rejecting their faith and rejecting their truth, and you're coming in, don't be like, ooh, we're winners and they're losers, right? God's going to be cutting off and going and goes, but I kind of think of it this way. It's almost as though God's given us our own clippers, right? where when we go into unbelief, we just kind of clip off our own branch that we're on. And Paul is always consistently going back to the root. And then verse 22, consider therefore the kindness and the sternness of God. Sternness to those who fell, but kindness to you, provided that you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will be cut off. And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. So just because someone doesn't look like they're part of it now, doesn't mean God can't bring them back later. And then verse 24, this is a key verse, and I'm going to explain something with it in just a moment. He goes, after all, if you were cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into a cultivated olive tree, how much more readily will these, the natural branches, be grafted into their own olive tree? So you're going to excuse me for a second, because I am not a horticulturist, I'm not a botanist, I don't know these things. But I did say this in the first service, so I told people that they could correct me after the first service. And I actually had someone said, no, you're right. That's exactly kind of how it works. So I'm like, woohoo, yay. But there's this line, it says this is a key line, it says, and after all, if you are cut out of an olive tree that is wild by nature, and contrary to nature were grafted into the cultivated olive tree, and then he says, how much more readily will these natural branches be grafted in? This is kind of the way to think of it. And Paul is making a very strong statement, specifically to the Gentiles, but also to the people of Israel. So I had one of the things that I had a privilege a number of years ago. I had a chance to go and do a visit of Israel, and one of the things that I got to see a fair bit of was these olive trees. Now we would think of them as orchards, but they were actually called gardens, like olive gardens, right? With these trees. And what's really cool about a number of these olive tree gardens, you can go into Israel today and still see olive trees that were there at the time of Jesus, like thousands of years old olive trees. They're pretty impressive, pretty amazing. But one of the things that they say about this is when you cultivate this garden, number one, it takes generations to do. And you engineer it in a way to have the healthiest, the strongest, right, the most productive trees possible. And because it takes so long, the one thing you would never do is take this, have these engineered, long established trees and gardens, find some wild olive tree kind of growing out in the woods somewhere, cutting off a branch and putting it in and grafting it into one of these rich and productive trees. You just wouldn't do that. Why would you take something weak and put it into something that's old and established? I kind of think of it this way. This is the way I think. It's like, imagine you're a young, healthy, like 25-year-old, and all of a sudden you need a transplant, but you get this transplant from like a 75 or 80-year-old person. Why would you take something that's old and weak and transplant it into something that's young and strong, right? Maybe it's a little bit the opposite way. He says, the very fact that God has grafted you in to this incredible root system that goes back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and the law that has now been opened up to everybody through Jesus Christ. Like, do you know how amazing that is? Like, you don't belong at all, but because of God's grace, he's done that. And he says, if God would do that for you, it doesn't make sense. How much more natural would it do that he would bring in those that were originally part of that root system? Just makes more sense. And in fact, the way that it often would work is if you were trying to establish a new thing, you would take a branch from a strong and established tree and then graft that into a weaker wild tree to try to bring it about, never the other way around. But he said that's what God has done in this picture. It's grace upon grace. But just as we close, what is Paul actually trying to get at? Right, back to this question we started off, how do we make sense of Israel, and what does any of this have to do with me? Well, how does Paul, again, answer this question? What are we to do with Israel? Has God rejected Israel? Yes or no? What does it look, is it one of those pictures that I put up there? Well, Paul answers it pretty definitively. Again, verse 1 begins this way. I asked then, did God reject his people? By no means. Verse 11, again, I asked, did they stumble so far as to fall beyond recovery? Not at all. Right? Paul's very clear. He's like, no, I haven't abandoned my people. I haven't forgotten my people. I've come through time and time and time again, and I will do it again. But notice he doesn't really give specifics of how that works. He just talks about a root and branches coming and going. Right? The thing that Paul is most concerned about is not necessarily what will happen in Israel and how that will all work. You know, it's important. It's a good question to ask. But ultimately, it's speculation. He brings it back. He goes, are you connected to the root? Right? Don't you fall away. Don't cut yourself off. And I think this is one of the things that we have a tendency to do. Right? We love looking at other people. We love judging other people. We love speculating other people, right? And again, there's a whole sort of cottage industry in Christianity about God's future plans for Israel and trying to figure it all out and putting these time charts together. Paul says, yeah, God's not going to abandon them. He's got a plan. But he turns around and says, are you connected to the same root? But some of them have left and rejected that root. Don't you make the same mistake. But we also do the same thing too. Just think about here where we are. We live in a small little community, but in this little community, we're across the street from an Anglican church. There's a Presbyterian church. There's a Pentecostal church. There's a United church. There's a Catholic church. And one of the questions that we often do, and we wrestle even within denominations, it's like, well, who's the real church? Who's the real dominant? Will God still be able to bring those awful Anglicans back in, or are they beyond redemption, right? And I can say that because I just encourage everybody to go to their Ash Wednesday service in a couple of weeks. And because Aaron's family goes there. But other than that, so they are beyond hope. We can all agree on that one. Don't tell your family I said that, okay, Aaron? I like it. Right, but again, we just go, well, what about them? What about this? And when you look at this and you try to understand Paul's heart, it's just like, my biggest concern is Trentside. Trentside Baptist. Are you connected to your root system? Are you holding on to this righteousness that was given to you through Jesus Christ and the work that he's done? Are you holding on to it? And very often, instead of just kind of pointing fingers and doing this, Paul's saying, pay attention that you don't fall away. Pay attention that your unbelief doesn't lead you the way it's led others. Maybe another way of even looking at it is not just as churches, but looking at it in our own homes, in our own lives, in our own families. It's easy to say, oh, I don't know if I like the way that family is raising their kids, but good thing we got, right? Are you keeping your family connected to the root system of Jesus Christ? Now again, we can encourage, maybe not use Paul's examples to shame others, but whatever. Yeah, keep other people motivated, but at the end of the day, are you rooted in Jesus? God will take care of his people. God may graft people back in and out, but at the end of the day, don't clip yourself off from the roots of Jesus Christ. Hold on. Hold on.